welcome to another meeting of the Ghoul Guides Association. We are, of course, the Ghoul Guides. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we are going to be continuing our little mini-series. We kicked off with solved, unsolved mysteries. And today we are going to be chatting true crime, the obsession with true crime, the history of true crime, and the Gothic of it all. So pretty excited for this one. I am a bit of a true crime girly myself, both in interest and personal history. But before we get into the nitty gritty of it, how are you, Mary?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Working on a new kind of project at the moment, which I get to work with, the one and only Kathleen Hudson.
Kathleen Hudson.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So my day has so far been filled with Kathleen, and now it's filled with you. So pretty good.
That is just the holy trinity, some may say.
Yeah. And stay tuned for mine and Kathleen's awesome cool project.
Which I may know something about.
Yeah. But how are you doing, Dr. Nixon?
I'm okay, thank you. It's real cold this week. It's like been -4 degrees, so that's been fun. But it was Austin Mondays this week, so if you are a Austin fan, if you've not been checking out Austin Mondays over on the Rosenbach, also with Kathleen Hudson,
yes,
and also a fantastic theatre director Casey, and of course the host Ed. We've been doing our weekly Austin read-alongs, and this week was my week. I missed the last one where we talked about all of the adaptations, which was a shame because I was poorly, so I did not get to discuss my absolute hatred for Keira Knightley as Elizabeth Bennet, which was a shame, but I have to save that for another time. But I was on this week. We talked about Lydia Bennet. I loved it. May have been delirious since it was midnight and it was very cold, but check it out and see for yourselves.
Absolutely do check it out. Not only for Jane Austen herself, but also for Lauren and Kathleen.
Yeah,
I am their biggest fans.
And you get excellent commentary from me, like Mr. Darcy's first proposal is the equivalent of a horny Instagram DM.
What more could you want?
What more could you want? That is the high quality content that you come here for. Okay, so I'm going to throw it over to you first, because whilst this is quite a perennial topic, there's actually some very important context that led us to want to talk about this particular topic at this particular moment in time, being awards season 2023.
Yeah, and if you watched our episode, our previous episode on unsolved mysteries, we did kind of talk a little bit about how that fits into the larger genre of true crime, and how there are kind of ethical issues within true crime, how we kind of mediate it, how it's presented to us, how it's shown as perhaps being perhaps the salacious and titillating parts are emphasized, and the kind of human aspects are not. And yeah, as you said, Lauren, we are in awards seasons, and if anyone has been paying attention to the Golden Globes, you will see
one of the big ones,
one of the absolute big American award shows. So if you have been paying attention to the Golden Globes, you will see that a certain Netflix TV series about one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the TV show is called Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. The actor who plays Jeffrey Dahmer in this show, Evan Peters, right?
Well done.
Yes, thank you. Evan Peters won in the best actor category for his performance in the show. And like the show itself, this award has gotten a lot of backlash, and I think it really gets into those kinds of ethical kernels and twists and issues around true crime, and specifically, I guess, the dramatizing of true crime, because I guess there's many different mediums of true crime, but one is this kind of semi-fictionalization or narrative that
Yes.
isn't a documentary. It's more of a drama performance. And obviously
Netflix has a tradition of releasing a documentary alongside a dramatization, but they don't put them as one thing. They don't promote them in the same way. The dramatization is always the main focus. It's always the big budget thing.
If you haven't seen it yet, you will probably have seen it promoted on Netflix, or you will have seen the controversy online, because it was one of Netflix's biggest shows.
It was absolutely huge.
It was huge. It in the first week of its release, it was number 1 on Netflix. It became Netflix's second most watched English language show of all time within 28 days. And it is the third Netflix series to pass 1 billion views in 60 days. It's very much a show. It's very much a show that people binged, and word of mouth definitely got around, and people watched it, and people want more. And I think so it was very controversial as a series when it was initially kind of shown, but one of the most controversial aspects of it is the characterization of Dahmer himself and the casting of Evan Peters. So if you don't know who Evan Peters is, he's one of the main recurring cast in the horror anthology series American Horror Story.
And I would say that outside of X-Men, so he was Quicksilver, the thing that he is mainly known for is being an American Horror Story.
Yes. And American Horror Story was also created by Ryan Murphy and his co-creator Ian Brennan. So they together created American Horror Story, and they also have created Dahmer, this Netflix series. They also co-created Glee.
Yeah, they also did the Versace documentary, which is also true crime, but it's a very different kind of true crime.
Well, they've also worked on another kind of true crime dramatization that I will get to at the end, but specifically looking at the kind of horror influences and the Gothicisation of true crime. Casting Evan Peters is interesting and controversial, because the first series of American Horror Story, Evan Peters plays essentially an incel who goes into his school and like a mass shooter essentially, or the ghost of one at least, and in that series they cast him as a romantic love interest, specifically for teens,
and that's a recurring thing. He's often the sort of troubled romantic anti-hero type character. And
I think he is a good actor.
He's great.
I just, there is something here that I think we should pause on, because casting someone like this who fits into that role of teen heartthrob, like you said, like troubled but romantic and a little bit sexy, and especially when you have someone who is already known for that in a controversial way, casting this actor to play Dahmer,
especially considering that it is the same creative team that made American Horror Story, that made Glee, and oh god, they were Scream Queens as well, weren't they? Right?
They were.
The other one is Scream Queens. So they have this reputation for these like very camp, high drama horrors, and even the Versace dramatization, you know, that is an inherently like, you know, fashion story. It's a dramatic story, it's a queer story, it's a tragedy, but it's a very different type of tragedy in true crime. But people come to Ryan Murphy specifically expecting a certain type of gothic, a certain type of horror. They expect something high energy, queer, maybe a bit salacious and taboo, which American Horror Story does, usually in a way that is explicitly fictionalized.
And I think that's the main difference. And I quite like American Horror Story. It's very transgressive and violent in some aspects, and it doesn't shy away from taboo and transgression in some areas, but it is fictional. And I think that there is valid criticism for that first series and specifically Evan Peters' character. but I think that you can get around that by saying, but it's fictional, and it's also exploring aspects of these individuals that maybe, given the prevalence of mass school shooters and teen shooters in America, maybe does, you know, need some kind of space. But when you come into a true story and you're dramatizing that true story, and you're maybe using horror conventions or actors who are known for horror roles, and specifically that troubled teen who you just want to love, and who is a little bit sexy, that's problematic. And this is the main controversy of the show. A lot of the family of Dahmer's victims criticized the show when it was being made. They criticized it when it came out, and again they're back saying that it is bad. So I have a quote from Shirley Hughes, is the mother of one of Dahmer's victims, and she's basically suggesting that Evan Peters's Golden Globes win is dangerous. So she says, there's a lot of sick people around the world. People winning acting roles from playing killers keeps the obsession going, and this makes sick people thrive on the fame. And so she said that another thing that she said was specifically critiquing Evan Peters's acceptance speech. She said that he should have used his acceptance speech to mention the families who were still suffering from Dahmer's crimes, or to say that Hollywood should put an end to telling stories about killers and glorifying them. So I think this is like another key thing as well. When you're dramatizing them, who are you putting at the fore? And I think,
because it's called Dahmer, it's the Dahmer story. It is not about the victims. It is about the man, Jeffrey Dahmer.
And we can go back to perhaps one of the most famous true crime stories of all time, which is Jack the Ripper. And again and again and again, whether in documentaries,
I'll talk a little bit about
or
him.
in dramatization, but he is at the forefront, and the victims, who are often, you know, women, or, you know, in you know, queer people or Black people, all these kinds of people who are the victims of these people, who are predominantly men, are left aside.
And the issue with Dahmer, and this is something, you know, the Dahmer story, things like appearance and the physical body and sexual attraction is very important when we think about the Dahmer case, in terms of us thinking about, you know, the fact that he was preying on mostly queer men, often queer men of color, and therefore people were less interested when these guys went missing. It's very similar to what happened with John Wayne Gacy, that they're preying on a specific type of person who's not going to, you know, be as missed by a society at the time. And this was my issue also with the Ted Bundy dramatization. And again, they cast Zac Efron. I personally think Zac Efron is a fantastic actor. I think he did a fantastic job in that. He is very attractive. Evan Peters is a little bit more of that like quirky, offbeat attractive, but they are both attractive Hollywood actors who have been the object of attraction specifically for young women.
Well, because Zac Efron is specifically that kind of teen heartthrob. And Evan Peters, I think, like you say, he's quirky, but he's trouble. But Zac Efron is often that kind of, you know, he's the guy that plays in the sports team. He's the jock. He's the kind of pinnacle of teen masculinity.
And I saw it myself after Dahmer came out. There was a lot of TikTok activity of this like romanticization and what I would call fetishization of Dahmer, which I think the way that they portrayed him as this almost sympathetic character. And this is not to say that you cannot have sympathy for people who are very unwell and do terrible things. There is definitely a place for a certain amount of empathy for people that commit crimes. That is not to say that you can present them as a sort of sympathetic anti-hero when he literally, spoiler alert / trigger warning, killed and ate multiple people. And it was terrible. Like, you know, it's a gross, like, it, not to be reductive, but it's a gross story.
But I think this is also where elements of the Gothic come in, because you know, like you say, like it is basically turning them into an anti-hero and a villain, but a sexy villain. And the Gothic has done that so well that these tropes are kind of there. And from the Byronic kind of anti-hero the 19th century, and the sexy anti-heroes of the
the
early Gothic.
Miltonian Lucifer.
Yes, sexy Satan, all these kinds
Mhm.
of rebellious or
Mhm.
misunderstood, always sexy, in some kind of way, whether through their personality or their charisma. Because I think this is one thing that a lot of people said about Dahmer, is that a lot of the accounts now are kind of writing over the fact that, saying that he was this really attractive man, and it's like, actually he wasn't as attractive as you might think. It's just that he had a lot of charisma. But casting someone like Evan Peters is a way to solidify that myth and that misnomer through this gothicization of the anti-hero.
Exactly, I completely agree. And I think the really interesting thing about true crime at the moment is that we need to be really mindful of the fact that this is a bigger, wider genre, and that when you are casting actors, when you have a creative team, that we know that there is a fandom out there that will watch anything that Ryan Murphy does. And that actually is quite dangerous, because that was an incredibly violent show, to the point that I would call it gratuitous. And, yes, I have an issue with a certain amount of violence, but I also see the need for violence in certain shows. That dramatization was gratuitous. It was not just like, you need to be aware of how horrible this thing was. It was very much like, oh, it's a Tarantino film almost. I have issues with Tarantino, but there is that thing of like, are you reveling in the violence? Or are you forcing someone to acknowledge the violence? Because I don't think, Jeffrey Dahmer is not one of those public figures necessarily where we have to keep reminding ourselves of how terrible he is. It's not like he made a comeback and then became a nice public figure. Like, he's Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah, he is very much widely castigated. But that does unfortunately, we're in an era where specifically men are a specific type of man are worshipped and almost deified. And there's always been this phenomenon of women who romanticize people like that. But yeah, that is the recent controversy about Dahmer, and specifically this Netflix series Monster. That when you mentioned that you wanted to talk about true crime, I was like, yes, we have to mention this, because it fits so well in the why true crime is Gothic, but also looking at that kind of that ethical kernel. And I think that we should, as people that do consume quite a lot of Gothic, but also we both consume quite a lot of true crime.
I think a lot of true crime.
We have to be aware of this. But I'll just finish this point by saying this is not the end of Monster, because it has been renewed for another series, and it's actually going to be an anthology series. We don't yet know who the other monsters will be, but it's possible, but that more serial killers might star in this series, and I think that is troubling.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah,
I really wish we could put serial killers to bed.
Yeah,
because I think that we know that serial killers are not just dangerous as individuals. We know serial killers are dangerous as public pop culture figures. And I don't vibe with it. I'm not down on it. As much as I love a true crime, I'm serial killers, I'm not interested. Like, but I guess that brings me to my little tour of the history of true crime, because I think that true crime is one of those things where there are definitely two types of people, or maybe three types of people that like true crime. But really, the salaciousness and the violence of it is actually not why most people enjoy true crime. It's a weird genre in that true crime, like, surely crime is true. But the reason we call it true crime is literally to separate it from fictional crime. So this is to separate true crime from things like Sherlock Holmes, from things like Agatha Christie, from, the popular long-standing genre of crime fiction. So it's not noir, it's not crime, it's not a murder mystery. We are talking about true crime. Now, I'm just going to preface this whole little history and discussion by saying that I personally, as an individual, am in fact a victim of a true crime. So my family has in fact been involved in a true crime incident. It was very distressing. We were in the news. I had to go to court. Not me personally, I wasn't on trial, but I had to sit in court and watch all these proceedings for like 18 months. So I just want to preface that because I think it's really important whenever we have these conversations about true crime to acknowledge the fact that we're not talking about a text. We're not talking about, a phenomenon. We're talking about individual people. And the difference with true crime is that often the people impacted by these incidents are still alive. And of course, usually when we're studying, we're talking about someone that was dead 200 years ago. I have no problem trash talking Edmund Burke. I probably would have still done it to his face, but I'm not going to upset somebody's relatives because he died hundreds of years ago now. The difference with true crime is you are still dealing with people who, in recent memory, have experienced this, whether or not it is the families of the victims or the families of the perpetrators, because that is also a very distressing experience when a member of your family or your friendship group, whoever it might be, commits a crime like this. So I just want to preface this before, because I'm sure we're going to joke, I'm sure we're going to laugh at things, and I just want to say that anything that we're going to talk about next is not only with me from my personal experience and how I feel about it, but also, that we firmly believe that this is something that we should hold to a high ethical standard. So that's just my little disclaimer.
And I think it's important though, because I think sometimes people, and just to go back to Jack the Ripper, you might think of Jack the Ripper and then the victims, but actually it's not just those 5 women that were killed and impacted by those crimes. And that's true of all true crime cases. There will be wider impacts on friends and relatives and also the community, because communities, I think, also have a kind of shock when an incident like this happens.
It's a huge thing when a community is impacted.
It can be quite long lasting.
100%. And obviously also these things can be quite triggering, and what I will say now is we will not be going into any deep details on this. This is mostly just an exploration of the history of true crime and the genre of true crime through the Gothic lens. But of course, if you're like, this one's not for me, feel free to step out. And if we are going to come up to say something that might be potentially triggering, we'll pop a trigger warning in there. So just want to make sure everyone's comfortable before we jump in, because true crime been around for a long ass time. So pretty much since there has been not only print media, but just culture, and a shared culture, be it literary or, word of mouth, true crime has been a thing. So often things like ballads and songs, be they written or otherwise, would be about an execution or a murder or a kidnapping. Crime has always been something that people have been incredibly interested in. And almost as soon as printing presses became a thing, and particularly once popular printing and easy, cheap printing became a thing, not only did you get, the rise of the Gothic and things like penny dreadfuls, but a massive interest in crime. Court reports would often be published. You would get pamphlets all about, the latest proceedings. And, this is one of the reasons why we know so much about things that happened, crimes that happened, and legal proceedings that happened in the 19th century, because everybody wanted to know about it and everybody was happy to pay a penny or whatever it might have been to go and find out about all the gory details of whatever crime it was that happened. So literally it goes back to, I would say, like, true crime probably goes back to like the 16th century, because you have, like pamphlets about witch crimes, you have pamphlets about murders, you have pamphlets about incest. So people were always interested in this. But really, if we're going to say, when did true crime start as a genre, it's got to be the late Victorian period. And, you didn't mention Jack the Ripper for no reason, Mary.
No, and I also, I don't know, sorry if you have notes on this, but I also think that the kind of relationship in the historical past, like the Victorian era, the relationship between society and violence was different, and
Yeah.
often it invited a kind of spectatorship of violence
Yes.
through
So that
public
is
executions. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So some of you may know this about me. I used to work in a prison museum where I used to have to pretend to be either a Victorian prison matron or a jailer. It was lots of fun. But for example, just in that small prison museum in Nottingham, multiple bodies buried under there, multiple public executions. And, you know, one of the reasons that they stopped executing people on the steps at what was the county jail at Nottingham is because there was a crush. It was so popular that somebody died in the crowd because there were so many people. So going to see a public execution was like a fun afternoon. People sold pies and beer. And people used it. There's pub. You will find almost always in cities where there are jails, there'll be at least one or two pubs across the street because people used to rent the rooms in the pubs so they could sit and look down at the public execution. It's also the reason why we have stocks. It's the reason why we have gibbets, all of these very public methods of not only torture, but of retribution for crimes.
And you can just imagine, can't you, that if you are a member of the public who has been reading about these crimes in the newspaper or in magazines, or you've been talking about them at work or, you know, in the coffee house or any kind of thing like that, you want to know how it ends. And the more notorious the criminal, then the more you want to go and get a good spot at the pub and make sure you've got I mean, snacks and you know, it's very
snacks
weird, but I think it is important. I think it's really, I mean, it's fascinating, but it's also important to note that we haven't always been as prudish or as inviting of violence as we have been in recent kind of decades.
And this is the thing, like, there, you know, particularly in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, I mean, obviously also much, much older, but as a society that's more interconnected. So I'm very much talking, you know, post beginning of the British Empire, so like 1750 onwards, but we're talking about like a society that can communicate as a whole country, not just little pockets. People wanted to see justice, and violence was perceived as being justice. It's the same reason when you have got a country that is hell-bent on making itself an empire, you have to convince your people that a certain type of justice is valid. And yes, Lauren has just brought war into another one of these episodes, but this is the thing, when you're trying to convince everybody that it's okay when British soldiers commit atrocities because they're the good soldiers and they commit the good violence, you start to create this notion that certain types of violence are good violence. So it does start to become like a public form of entertainment because that is a terrible person. They are deserving of this punishment. Let's all go and watch the justice be served, essentially. So true crime very much has its origins in this public execution, in, you know, this hype and this fervor that, you know, started happening, particularly after the dawn of the newspaper and, you know, the penny circular and the penny dreadful. People wanted to see these people have their comeuppance, but they also wanted to read about it. And I would say the reason we pinpoint Jack the Ripper as being the kind of start of true crime is because it's one of the first major unsolved ones. And as we said last time, there's a lot of overlap between unsolved and true crime. And obviously people were fascinated, but it also scared people, it terrorized people. So people also felt like they needed to know all the details because it could happen to them. And this is one of the major pulls of true crime. True crime is one of the big things that people are invested in when it comes to true crime, is that it gives a sense of knowledge. You know, you have the knowledge, you're informed, and therefore you are prepared. And if this thing happens to you, you will be prepared. Now, of course, that's a bit of a false security, but it makes people feel better. And in the Victorian period, particularly the late Victorian period, we are talking about a country, particularly here in the UK, but also in the US. So I'm talking particularly about Western true crime. Obviously, it is a global phenomenon, but I'm talking particularly about the Western one. It made people feel more comfortable. The more they could read, the more they could know, the better informed they were. Knowledge is power. And that's why the Jack the Ripper case really sparks it. So in terms of like how true crime develops, like we've always had true crime stuff in the same way we had, you know, the diaries of explorers, we had the diaries of, you know, lawyers, and we had accounts, we had court reports. I mean, even executioners used to keep very meticulous diaries. I once had to log an executioner's diary when I was working in the archives at the prison museum. It was really quite distressing. Also because he was real bad at his job. Like he was always like take the measurements and then be like, oh, did they actually strangle to death, or did they actually break their necks? They did not. It was not quick. It was awful. I mean, interesting, but awful. But
I mean,
really,
you say that and it makes me think of, there's been some recent cases in America, because America still has
capital punishment.
Capital punishment, where they've had to stop in the middle of an execution.
Oh my god, because they've done
the drug has been either administered wrong, or the dosage has been incorrect, and the person has suffered horribly in this moment, and they've had to stop it and then either, you know, come back to it another day, or imagine, it's just horrible. God. And I think this is one aspect of, you know, capital punishment that I find quite hard to get my head around and justify, because somebody, if I mean, individuals that have all often done and are often
horrible things,
but why should anyone have to be the individual, or the individuals, or part of a system that then murders them?
And you know, as someone who actually has been a victim of one of these crimes, I don't want to see that person murdered in turn. Like, partially because I'm cruel, and I think it's much crueler to make someone suffer in prison or in an instant, you know. I think that's much more fitting punishment. But you know, how does that make me any better? Like, I suffered this thing, so your family have to suffer this thing too. Nah, I'm not okay with it. But obviously that's maybe another episode for another time, because capital punishment, actually, there's a lot of Gothic around that. You get a lot of ghost stories and demons and stuff, and it's people that have been killed by capital punishment. But that's another phenomena. But in terms of true crime as, like, shall we say, a literary tradition, it kind of hits its stride in the late 80s and the early 90s. So yes, of course, the 60s and the 70s are what's often referred to as like the golden age of the serial killer, which I don't like that phrase. Let's not use that. The 60s and the 70s is the dawning of global media, of global news reporting. So it's always, you know, people always say, like, well, were there serial killers before? And part of it is that, yes, there was. We just didn't know about it. The Vietnam War, and the Korean War have a lot to answer for, because particularly with the US, you have this whole massive disenfranchised, very troubled generation of men, whether they served or not, you know, huge impact. But the interest in these things and the fascination starts to become really popular when we start to get cheap magazine printing and daytime TV. So, for example, in 1990, a magazine was founded that, if you're from the UK, you probably know. It's called Take a Break. It is the single trashiest thing you've ever seen in your entire life. If you're not in the UK, this magazine is a really it's essentially what it's called. It calls itself you know, like an interest magazine, but it's a quote unquote housewife magazine. And in this magazine, you will find everything from tips for how to get stains out of your sofa using, you know, cheap hacks like bicarb of sofa. You will get the news on what's happening on the soaps. So they'll be like, oh, this is coming up in EastEnders, this is going to happen in Emmerdale. And then there will be a series of real life crimes. So on the front page, there'll be a picture of someone, and they'll be like, oh, this is going to happen this week on, you know, Coronation Street. And then right next to it, it will say something like, my boyfriend killed and ate my children and then buried me alive. And I'm joking and being over the top, but I also feel like that could be a genuine take a break headline.
But because they have no chill, right? And there's loads of things that the quotes they put pick out, and the headlines, they're so absurd
Yes.
and almost ridiculous to the point of unbelievability, and that's
Mm-hmm.
what grabs you, right? Because
Yep.
you pick up the magazine because you're like, oh my gosh, this is so
Yep.
absurd, I need to know like
Mm-hmm.
what this story is.
Yep. And there's this very much this idea, because it was targeted not only at women, but particularly at housewives, at retired women, this beginning of like this kind of like pop culture true crime very much was sort of, this could happen. These people are lurking everywhere. So the more you read, the more you know, the more you will be able to spot these people, and this won't happen to you. You've got children. You've got families. You need to protect yourself. You're a mother, you're a grandmother, you're a member of your community. You need to be aware that people like this exist, and you need to be on the lookout for them. And this went hand in hand with, now this is originally quite an American genre, but the true crime daytime TV. So generally cable channels, and obviously later you get like Sky and digital and satellite. Starts out as cable channels, and these are these real life, and they would have, the shows would have really kind of like titles that were like, survivors, or I married a murderer, and and they would be half recreation, low budget recreation, and half talking heads. So the people that it actually happened to, or actors giving their words if those people didn't want to be on the shows, and recreations of these crimes. And this kind of all went alongside the rise of things like Maury, the Jerry Springer Show, Jeremy Kyle are here in the UK. This kind of, you might watch this at 3:00 in the afternoon while you're doing your ironing, and from the safety of your home, probably your middle class home in a suburb or a nice quiet neighborhood, you could watch these terrible things that had happened to other people and not only feel reassured, thank God that's not happened to me, makes you feel better about yourself, but also I know what the signs are. So the early true crime very much is existing in the same genre as your Jerry Springer shows, as your kind of like, oh, what are these people, the shocker exposés that might be on Channel 5 at 10:00 at night, that would be on after, the people that fell in love with their cars or go dogging.
Channel 5 honestly has a lot to answer for.
Channel 5, man.
In terms of its true crime, can you call them documentaries? I don't know.
And
I remember one, and it was a professor, I forget who it was now, but he basically had a scale of evil, and every week you would get a different true crime,
he like rated them,
serial killer, and he would tell you how they rated. It escapes my mind. It was like, I'll Google it and I'll put it in the comments.
It was like the dark side of Crime Watch. Like you got, so if you're not from the UK, you had Crime Watch, and Crime Watch would be like, this store is maybe selling knockoff goods, and also we think that there's a robber in this area, or we've had this unsolved murder. So Crime Watch was intended to be like, every week you sat down and you were updated on things that you needed to know that were going on in the UK. These shows were sort of sometimes filmed in the same way. So you would have a presenter, and Crime Watch, they were like in an office that was like, oh, is it the police? And sometimes these shows would do the same things. And, we talked about the original Unsolved Mysteries. There's a lot of interconnection between these, but things like Take a Break and these shows like Jeremy Kyle and Jerry Springer would pay the people involved a very small sum of money. And most of these people were from low-income families, often of a lower education status, and essentially is taking advantage. So true crime begins in this very violent Victorian era, and then in the 80s and 90s, like, the boom of modern pop culture, it's very exploitative. It is here. Are these horrible things that have happened so that you can sleep soundly at night because it didn't happen to you. Now, that's not to say that it's not without a certain amount of entertainment value, and we can still find some, I enjoyed these things. I obviously was like a teenager, so I don't think it occurred to me how like ethically problematic they were. But these were quite popular, but it was very much regarded, and I think you would probably agree, it was trash TV.
Oh yeah, Channel 5 has a reputation for being quite I don't know if trashy is the right word, but a lot of its content is a bit not necessarily grounded
Yes.
as other channels are. And that specific kind of again, like, I don't know if you can call it a documentary. I guess it was. And I watched them, but I mean, even when I was watching that Scale of Evil one, I was like, but how are you defining evil?
Right,
Because these are
this is a deep philosophical concept.
well, yes, but it's also quite a Gothic concept. It's that
Yes.
kind of thing where it's like, I don't know that we should be using that kind of language. These are people who have committed crimes and they're horrible. And maybe we can call them monsters, but also maybe we should think about that, because that kind of
Yes.
monsterizing and gothicizing and seeing these people as evil,
Yes,
I think,
and it
removes them from humanity, but also then means that
exactly.
these people, these individuals, and then these characters are seen as just that, as characters,
Yes.
that then give scope and leaves them open to
Yeah.
become, you know, gothicized anti-heroes.
Yes, and I mean, we're so in sync. That is exactly what I was going to say, that these like trashy sort of late night or daytime, often on so terrestrial channels, so like the channels everybody had, you know, ITV late at night or Channel 5, and then when like digital and satellite television became more popular, channels like Living and TLC. So the same channels that were putting on shows about weddings and shows about people with a bunch of kids, also showing this type of content, like Take a Break, the magazine does.
Yeah, I also remember Channel 5 having a lot of documentaries about weird conspiracy theories.
Yes.
And like stuff about, was Mary Magdalene actually like Jesus's lover, and all this stuff about the Knights Templar. But when I say about conspiracy theories, I mean as if maybe the conspiracy theories were true. And I watched a lot of them, but always like, well, this is interesting, but also I'm not really sure about the
and this was like when we just had
the editorial line
like even
show.
in like 16, 17 with like dial-up internet, I was like, oh, well, we probably had broadband by then, but I remember being like, well, that's not what I read in my history book.
So think the Da Vinci Code, but as if rather than somebody writing a book about those kinds of conspiracy theories, somebody creating a show and then like it being publicized as a documentary. And that's exactly how these serial killer shows or these shows about true crime, specifically on Channel 5,
they'd often be made in the same way as people that thought they'd seen ghosts or had near-death experiences. So they were very much aligned to things like conspiracy theories, unsolved mysteries, and the paranormal. So yeah, for a really long time, this is a genre that is very much maligned, which also is a real connection to the Gothic, because whilst I do have a problem with the way that a lot of this media, both print and film, was made, it was mostly dismissed because it was perceived as being for women, being for people of a lower economic or educational status, being trashy, and therefore being dismissed. And I do think that's super problematic. I also think that it kind of diminishes those people's real life experiences. But it was kind of pushed to the side. It was, you know, in there with things like Mills and Boone. It was in there with things like ghost hunting shows. So it's very much this kind of on the periphery. This is lowbrow. This is trashy. Now that starts to change with the dawn of the podcast. So podcasts become really popular around about the early 2010s. They've been around a little bit longer than that. And obviously radio shows, podcasts, there's a big overlap. And people had radio shows like this before podcasts were a medium. But when downloading music, when everybody having either a smartphone or an iPod or a similar MP3 player becomes a thing, we start to get the podcast as a medium. And obviously here we are on a podcast talking about true crime podcasts.
Well, I think one of the things is that radio, especially with younger generations, so millennials and Gen Z, it's kind of gone a little bit out of vogue. You don't necessarily go to turn on the radio, because you turn on Spotify or you put on a music playlist, or then you put on a podcast. And in some ways podcasts do things that are similar to a radio, but to a radio show, but what they did, and this is also what, you know, Spotify did, is it allowed you to choose when you listen to it. and
exactly.
where and how. And yeah,
And it
just
also
gave the listener a little bit more control.
It also allowed edit, and it was also an affordable medium, as was the case now. Podcasting equipment, yes, you do need to invest if you want something decent, but anybody with a microphone could do a podcast, particularly if you were a single person doing it on your own. You didn't need a studio or anything like that. And it meant that investigative journalists, it meant that researchers, academics, and, also people like Alex Jones, but it meant that if you had a specialism, you could actually make something and put it out to people, very, very low budget, but of quite a decent quality. And podcasts start to pick up popularity, particularly when Spotify, around about 2013, 2014, Spotify becomes huge. All of a sudden, a lot more music is licensed on Spotify, and this is when people started paying for Spotify accounts. So Spotify has been around since around about 2008, 2009 as like a popular platform, but there wasn't that much music on it. Around about 2013, 2014, it starts to get really, really big. And podcasts get bigger and bigger alongside it. And of course, we also have Apple Music and Google Play. But Spotify was nice and easy because it was seen as being this kind of, hilariously, bit more of an independent platform, because it was the first one to let you listen to things for free. Now, you did have to listen to adverts, or you could pay X amount per month and you could listen to anything on Spotify. And of course, now multiple platforms do this, but Spotify was really the one to pioneer this. And podcasts, the rise of podcasts go very much hand in hand. Now, this podcast I'm about to mention was not the first true crime podcast, but I think it's very, very clear that this is the podcast that kicks it all off. In 2015, an investigative journalist Sarah Koenig made a podcast called Serial. Now, Serial was about the murder of an 18-year-old girl, Hyman Lee. She was a student in the US, and it was suspected that she had been murdered by her boyfriend, Adnan Syed. Now, I'm not going to go into this case because actually Serial has been quite controversial, particularly in recent years, the way that things went down. In fact, there's a really great parody of Serial on the Disney Plus show Only Murders in the Building, which is a delightful kind of crime show that I highly recommend. But Serial was massive. It really sparked the genre, and it has been downloaded over 200 million times. This was huge, absolutely huge. And people got invested in this incident. And after that, not only do more true crime podcasts start popping up around about 2017 and 2018, it starts to make the transition onto media, because what else became really popular in the early 2010s? Netflix. So in the same way that Spotify let people listen to whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, for a set price per month, so did Netflix. Once Netflix became a streaming app and not a service where you said, I'd like to watch this film, and they sent a DVD to your door, which I cannot believe that's how. I remember when Netflix started and I was like, this is ridiculous and it will never catch on.
It had another name, didn't it? Because it was kind of like that buffer between Blockbuster and what we now know as Netflix, the streaming service. What was it, Love Film or something like that?
I think Love Film and Netflix were rivals, and then Netflix consumed Love Film.
But yeah, it was basically, you don't want to have to go to a physical
Blockbuster
shop. You don't want to go to Blockbuster to pick up a VHS tape. Why don't you just sit in your home and tell us what you want? We'll send it to you. Then once you've watched it, you can send it back. And then they were like, or maybe we can just create a
put
service
it all on
and put it on there. And I do have issues with streaming platforms, which we will not discuss in this in this episode, because it is a massive tangent. But what I will say is that I remember when Serial came out, not because I listened to it, but because at the time I was working in a shoe shop, and my assistant manager at the time, just every week I'd come in and she would be like, oh my God, Mary, you have to listen to this. And she would just tell me what happened in every single episode.
And it very much became like people watching a soap opera, or like people watching, BBC often do a 6-part or a 3-part crime drama, and people get really invested, really into it. Who's the, like Broadchurch was a great example. Who's the murderer? So 2015 Serial, it really kicks things off. 2018, Netflix releases Making a Murder. And it was huge. It was for a long time the platform's biggest show. And it's also very controversial because
people often talk about Making a Murderer. I mean, when people talk about Netflix now, what you hear is Stranger Things. Stranger Things. Which show is going to be the next Stranger Things?
Yeah.
Can you beat their like first week, binge watch? How do your kind of figures stack up? That's why we have the 28 days figures. If you go back to the beginning and listen to the figures that we read off in terms of Dahmer and the monster TV show. But actually what really kicked off Netflix and put it in the map was Making a Murderer.
100%.
It's so important.
It's one of the first big documentary shows that was split into multiple episodes for the streaming platform. Up until this point, documentary for the most part had been film. So things like Catfish, for example, one of the biggest, most popular like millennial documentaries was the original Catfish documentary, which I think is 2007 or 2008. Making a Murderer really solidifies what we now know to be the true crime documentary format. Multiple episodes, shot over a certain period, a mixture of interview footage, original footage, all sorts of things now have used this, things like The Jinx, things like Wild Wild Country, and Netflix in particular made itself the platform, the producer of this type of true crime. And it elevates it. It takes true crime from something that's trashy, that's something that's on a par with paranormal stories and near-death experiences and Maury, to something that is a serious documentary, not a Channel 5 9:00 at night on a Thursday documentary. So it elevates it. True crime is starting to win awards. It's starting to be recognized alongside, legitimate forms of media. So it becomes really, really popular. Now, true crime for the most part on television, somewhat equally popular with the genders, but overall, as a genre, and particularly as a podcast genre, because that's still the kind of most popular platform, over 60% of listeners and consumers of true crime media are female. And they tend to be late 20s, early 30s, which we are that exact demographic. So true crime still is an incredibly female skewing genre. And I think, again, when we're thinking about it as an extension or something within the Gothic, that makes complete sense, because the consumers of the Gothic have always been young women. Now, yes, I'm saying women in their late 20s and early 30s, but when we think about young women on the cusp of adulthood, the young women on the cusp of adulthood that were about to go and be married and be mothers and things like that in 1790 were 18. Now they're in their late 20s and early 30s. So I do think I would argue we're still looking at the same demographic. And that's not to say that younger women, not to say that men, not to say that, people of all genders are interested, but it is a predominantly female focused genre.
I think makes sense as well, and this is another function of the Gothic, in that, like, ultimately when you strip it down, what are some of the key threats and monsters within the Gothic, and
exactly,
and it's men, and it's patriarchal systems that enable and allow domestic abuse, sexual violence, all these kinds of things. And it's often men, not always, and there are other Gothic narratives, but it's a very important aspect of the Gothic that you have young women being chased, threatened, murdered, violated by men. And that's exactly what true crime, so much of true crime is about.
And so this is the thing. So the University of Derby did a study, and there's an article about it. I'll try and remember to put a link in the comments, but University of Derby articles suggested that one of the biggest attractions when it comes to true crime is problem solving. Problem solving and preparation, that true crime invites you not only to scratch that brain itch for problem solving and to think about how could this be done differently, because a lot of true crime now is about, well, why did this happen? I'll talk about that in a moment, but a lot of it, they said, was problem solving. And actually, when I was reading the article, I was like, well, this is the same as the Gothic and the attraction of the Gothic. The attraction that they say is for people, particularly women with true crime, is to be more aware, to be more understanding, to know how these things happen and what might go wrong, and to, you know, be prepared. There's this element of preparation. This is exactly why women were writing Gothic novels and other women were reading Gothic novels back in the late 1700s. And this is something that has continued to be a massive part of the Gothic the whole way through. And I think that's why what is also really interesting is that a lot of true crime mediums cross over with supernatural explorations, with paranormal, with conspiracy and unsolved mysteries. So this is where things, you know, we talked about this last time, BuzzFeed Unsolved, one half's true crime, the other half is supernatural. Those two aspects of the show, often supernatural was more popular, but that's because Shane and Ryan were actually going out and doing investigations. I think, you know, that's because of the way the different things were, but there is a massive overlap between people being interested in those two things. And again, that is we talked about this last time, like the Gothic potential. If someone goes missing and has not been found, we all have that thing of like, oh yeah, we assume that this terrible thing happened or there's a potential murderer, but there always is that little bit of possibility that something supernatural happened if that's the way that you see the world. So there's definitely a huge overlap between those things. And also some of the most popular creators are women. So not only, again, is this that women are the people consuming this media, they're also the ones producing it. So two of the most popular, frequently in the top 5 list, true crime podcasts are My Favorite Murderer, which has had books, it's done tours, it's hugely popular. The two hosts are now kind of like celebrities in their own right. Other podcasts often reference them like as their sources of research. They're very good, and they were one of the biggest. And their tagline is like, stay sexy and don't get murdered. So they very much created this podcast and created this brand that others have now taken on of, this is a feminine space, not an exclusionary feminine space. I just want to make that really clear. But this is a feminine space. This is a space where, you know, we are taking power of our sexuality, of our gender. We are pushing back against the violence of the patriarchy. And we're acknowledging all of these crimes that have been committed, but we're also preparing ourselves. We're educating ourselves. We're sharing that knowledge, like we shared ghost stories, like we shared stories of monsters, like we shared Gothic tales, to protect ourselves as a community.
It's the Whisper Network.
It's the
Whisper Network that protects women. You know, that man's a creep. Stay away from this person because, you know, he's really touchy-feely, and you don't want to be alone with this person because, you know, bad things happen.
You know, exactly.
Because women don't often have power, and also people who are, you know, in minorities don't often have power.
Yes.
Whisper networks are a way to get that information across. But this is just a kind of bringing that out into the open, because it's not really a, you know, private hushed conversation in the toilets, you know.
Exactly.
Or,
so
you know.
My Favorite Murder very much, I would say, were like the trailblazers of this genre. You also have Morbid, which the two co-hosts Ash and Elena are related, and one of them used to be, so Elena used to be a mortician. She was a morgue technician essentially. So she did autopsies. That was her job. So again, she had that, you know, they called it Morbid because it was originally about like their interests. Sometimes they do ghost stories, sometimes they do unsolved mysteries, sometimes they talk about paranormal things. So you've got this crossover. So two of the most popular podcasts in this genre are not only by women, but are two women with a close relationship talking to each other, which we have 100% jumped on that bandwagon. You know, that is exactly the genre that we are in. But there is this, you know, definite interest of women talking to women for women, often about other women. Of course, the other major platform here is YouTube. YouTube and its accessibility made it really easy for people to create this content. And for example, I would say probably the most popular kind of true crime YouTuber is Bailey Sarian. She has 6.72 million YouTube subscribers. She also has, I don't know how many subscribers she has in terms of the podcast. Her show is Murder, Mystery, and Makeup. So she combined the popular Get Ready With Me makeup tradition, which generally appeals to either a young female or young queer audience, with true crime. So while she does her makeup, she talks about a true crime story. The videos are anything from 20 minutes to an hour long. She's been doing this for years. She's now got another show called Dark History. And I will confess, I'm a big Bailey fan. She's very funny, but there's something very satisfying about watching her do her makeup. And I learn how, I'm like, oh, I'm going to try my makeup like that while she talks about these true crime stories. Now, all of these have drawn criticism because there is this anxiety that these kind of, I don't want to say lighthearted, but these jokey, conversational platforms are not taking these things seriously. Now, I will say, and I'm conscious that this might be my bias as a consumer of this media, the difference here, and particularly when you look at those kind of trashier 90s products, is that generally they're always victim focused. The content, and you'll notice this with some of the better documentaries that have come out on Netflix and other streaming platforms in recent years, there's a difference between the victim focus and the criminal focus. And what's really fascinating is a lot of these female produced or queer produced texts are very much interested in who did this happen to, let's memorialize them, and why did this happen? What happened to this person to make them this way? How do we understand how it came to this point? There's no glorification in the violence, and often they skip over the actual crime itself. What they're usually interested in is the lead up and then what happened afterwards. Police failure, systematic biases. And, like Bailey's catchphrase is get better idols, get better role models. So her thing is always like, do not idolize these people. And, there is this thing like the morbid girls, they call their fan base their weirdos. So there is this kind of idea of it being an offbeat community, but it's very, very different from the earlier 90s, either glorification of serial killers, which we saw a lot, or the trash TV elements of it. But that's not to say that true crime has not had its issues. Okay, so that's not to say that the rise of the true crime genre isn't without its problems. And I will still say that, like my consumption of the Gothic, it can be problematic. I think we can both agree that sometimes you watch something that's Gothic or you read something that's Gothic and you're like, no, this hits wrong. This is not using the taboo and the violence in the way that I want to see it.
I think about this question a lot, the ethics of consumption, specifically when it comes to controversial things, because I am, unsurprisingly, as you may not have noticed from the picture of Buffy, I'm a massive fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which obviously has its issues. Recently around its creator Joss Whedon, but also in terms of, if you rewatch it now, there are some scenes, some dialogue, and some kind of narratives that do sit a bit uncomfortably with you. And I think the way to look at it is that you can still love and enjoy and consume these things whilst also critiquing them, and
yes, exactly,
loving something and being a fan of something, or even just being, a listener, like a casual listener or a casual like viewer of these things, doesn't necessarily mean that you endorse everything about it.
Yes. And as with the Gothic can be used to transgress. It can also be used conservatively. And true crime is the same. So, for example, the Lacey and Scott Peterson case, which was a big American case, it's technically still unsolved. Google it. It's a big, complicated one. But Amazon has a documentary. I don't think it's Amazon produced, but there's a documentary that is very pro Scott, who ostensibly is the criminal in the case. And that documentary used the true crime format and genre to paint him sympathetically in the same way that the Dahmer dramatization has. So true crime can be used in the same way that the Gothic can be used, either to be subversive, to be, you know, to challenge the patriarchy, to challenge systematic bias, to challenge racism, to challenge, you know, gender inequality and homophobia and violence. It can also be used to manipulate an audience. But it can also go a little bit haywire. So, for example, one very, very famous case, been covered in BuzzFeed Unsolved, you can probably find an episode about this on any true crime series, is the case of Elisa Lam, who was found dead at the Cecil Hotel in LA in the water tank. Nobody's really sure how she got there. There's some very strange media around it. But because of the true crime fandom, because of the online fandom for things, and I am calling it a fandom because even the people that don't necessarily, you know, I'm a fan, I would say maybe I'm a consumer, because it's weird to be a fan of crime, unless you're a criminal. I'm a fan of crime in some circumstances, but, you know, we've talked about that, revolution. But the online communities and fandoms around these true crime cases led people to find that this guy called Pablo Vergara had checked into the Cecil Hotel not long before Elisa Lam had, and he was a artist, shall we say, and internet personality who engaged in the very dark and often quite problematic side of the Gothic and horror. He had, you know, songs about rape and murder, some really dark stuff, but a person, not a person I would necessarily want to interact with, and probably a person whose art I would critique and would question. But essentially, you know, this is one of the examples of where true crime fandom can go a little bit haywire. People made a connection, and because of the stuff that he had produced and put online, they wondered if he had killed Elisa Lam. This guy's life was ruined, absolutely ruined, because the whole of the internet, basically in this portion of the internet, became convinced to a certain extent that he was the person that had committed this crime, and that the things that he had put out ostensibly as art meant that he was the type of person that would do this. Again, I don't like his art. I think his art is problematic, but it is art. He has not said, I personally as an individual want to do these terrible things to women. I think he probably does, because, you know, there's a fine line there, but this is just such a good example of where that line is blurred. And it reminds me of Catherine Morland going to Northanger Abbey and assuming that General Tilney has killed his wife, because she's consumed so much Gothic fiction that she misunderstands. He's still a terrible person. He didn't murder his wife. It's the same. I feel like it's the same thing.
You get so hung up on specific clues and making them fit into a certain narrative that you make massive leaps. And ultimately, you know, if there was any evidence, then that's one thing, but if all you have is circumstantial kind of conjecture, then that's something completely different.
Yes, exactly. And I also think that connects to the difference between the gratuitous and the contemplatory, shall we say. And it's almost like the sort of like in-text fight between Matthew Lewis and Anne Radcliffe. Now, I still love The Monk. I think it's brilliant. Had I read The Monk when it came out, maybe I would have been offended by it and thought, actually, this is not, you know, I can see someone reading The Monk when it comes out in 1796, is it The Monk? It's after Udolpho, isn't it?
It's 96,
96, yeah. And being like, oh, this is gratuitous violence against women. I mean, it is basically pornographic. It got in trouble for being blasphemous.
Yeah.
You know, and for us now, it's not that bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't really know what it says about the standards of pornography in the late 18th century, but it was castigated for being blasphemous and pornographic to the point that it was censured in Parliament.
And like, you know, maybe it was dangerous. We definitely, you know, this is what we've just said earlier about Dahmer, and there's definitely some horror and Gothic that comes out, and I look at it and I think, this has not been made responsibly. This has not been made you know, clear. This is not, you know, this actually celebrates and glorifies. And that certainly does happen. And you get this also with true crime. And I think things like the Ripper Museum in London, which opened in 2015, and you know, it's very disrespectful to the victims. It caught a lot of flack for this. And someone who will probably end up talking about again in this series, Zach Baggins, opened the Haunted Museum in Las Vegas. He has items and artifacts from serial killers. There is a side to this that is very glorifying, very salacious, and you know, invites that kind of level of fandom. It places people like Dahmer on the same level as somebody like Elvis Presley.
It's a fandom that ultimately seeks to elevate through celebrity or grossness or just uniqueness, but it is essentially elevating and in some respects celebrating the violent aspects of the crime, you know. Having, you know, collecting items from serial killers is weird,
and we know this is dangerous because we know that the way that the Manson murders were reported on garnered Charles Manson a whole much larger cult following than the actual cult that he ordered to do those horrendous crimes. So we know that there's a danger here, and we know that these are problems, and I think this is what's also really interesting, and I guess this is where I'll end, because I think we're going to pick up on the real life horrors next time. Is what's really interesting is that we are now gothicizing the response to true crime. And this has been happening for a while. So there was a really cheesy, it got cancelled after one series, there's a really cheesy vampire TV show in the late 2000s called Moonlight that featured a vampire detective. And one of the storylines, I don't know if you remember this, was about a Charles Manson type cult leader, and it you know, it was very convoluted, but that show had, you know, it was a very gothic show, it was very camp, very cheesy, but it explicitly was gothicizing people's response to these true crime incidents. We're going to start to get stuff about the Manson family women, focusing more on them and why these things happened to them and how they got there. So gothicizing, you know, both to reclaim certain elements and also to criticize certain elements. But yeah, what's really interesting is as true crime has become more and more popular, the Gothic response to it has also become more and more popular. And I think over the next couple of years, we'll start to see some really interesting Gothic texts about true crime. I mean, we already have Only Murders in the Building, which is a super, super charming true crime show. Stars Selena Gomez, and oh my god, they've Martin Shaw and Steve Martin. So, you know, if you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you probably know them from some of your childhood favorites. But the idea is it's these three people living in this building in New York, and they start a true crime podcast because they're all fans of a true crime podcast. And I think we're going to start to see more and more kind of stuff coming out like that, both in fiction and, you know, in media, because it is such a Gothic medium, and that's why it blends so seamlessly with the supernatural, and it blends so seamlessly with unsolved mysteries, because it essentially blurs the line between fiction and reality for good and for less good. And I think the same way that the Gothic can be comforting, and this is like the thought I'll end on, is, you know, often when I tell people that I'm a true crime fan, quote unquote, they're quite shocked because I have been through a real life experience. I find it comforting. It comforts me to know that other people in the world have been through these things. It comforts me to know that, you know, these things have happened, and I'm very interested, even more so after what I went through, in understanding why these things happen and why people do these things, but also the responses to them. And I think in the same way that people can read some really dark shit in the Gothic over and over again because they find it comforting, true crime has that same safety and darkness to offer.
it's dark, but you're basically exposing it and shining a light on it.
Mhm.
And yeah, I totally get that.
And it's kind of like, you know, one of the things that the Gothic in its earliest truest form is about refusing to let terror become horror. It's refusing to go from an experience that is transformative and that you as an individual can take ownership of. Because the things that happen, you know, the things that happen to cause terror are also very capable of causing horror. And it's not to say, oh, if you can't transform it, then you're weak, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. But there's this idea that you've been through something traumatic, you've been through something terrifying. It's okay. You can take ownership of it, you can take control of it, and you can carry on living your life. And that's essentially what the Gothic heroine and the Gothic romance is all about. True crime has that same ability. And I don't think it's shocking that a lot of true crime fans, a lot of true crime creators also then will write murder mysteries, will write crime fiction, will go on to do degrees or to kind of, you know, become part of the legal system, because it motivates people in a certain way. I mean, people like Amanda Knox have got podcasts.
Yeah.
You know, there's definitely like this close correlation, and I think it, because it creates community, that's the, you know, that's the thing. The Gothic has that unique ability to create community. True crime does the same thing. It is also in some places very dark and problematic, and, you know, we could talk about that for hours and hours and hours. But I think what's really clear is that from its earliest history, true crime is it's a subsection of Gothic. It has an inherent Gothicness to it.
And I think as well, you know, to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning with Dahmer, and also to look forward to what we'll be talking about next week, it does, as a genre, true crime does have the potential to blur the line between fiction and reality. And I think that can be dangerous, but it's also, I think, something that makes people interested. You know, why do you want to go and read about all the different theories about Jack the Ripper or any kind of different serial killer, and then have someone tell you, but this one isn't right, but this one isn't right, and this is what's really happening? Because you want to know all the possibilities, and you want to know, and, you know, it's that like Gothic motivation to solve the mystery. But yeah, fascinating. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, friend.
This was really fabulous.
I think there's so much to say about this, and, you know, it might be that we return to some of the more, like, you know, the more specific areas in future, but I think this will I think that this will lead really nicely into our next discussion, and I think we'll have some more time to think about the ethics of using real life events to create horror media.
So if that sounds like something you want to know more about, then join us next time. And if you've enjoyed if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you like and subscribe. And leave us a comment as well.
Tell a friend.
Hop
on the Ko-fi. Follow us on Instagram. I keep forgetting to post there, but you know, if people follow us, then I'll be reminded to post there.
And I guess in the meantime, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.